Today we're going to look at section 5.4 of factoring quadratic expressions, and we're going to look at part 1 for lesson 1. In this part of the lesson, we're going to look at finding common factors of quadratic and other algebraic expressions. So let's start by talking about greatest common factor. A greatest common factor is the largest factor that all terms in the expression have in common. If your greatest common factor is not 1, then your expression can be factored by using the distributive property and removing that greatest common factor from each of your terms. Keep in mind that when I'm talking about greatest common factor, I'm talking about factors are things that can multiply together to make your expression. So you're talking about numbers that multiply together to make your number, variables that multiply together to make your variable expressions. That's what we're looking for when we talk about a greatest common factor. So if you look at my first example that I have here, 4x cubed plus 20x squared, you're going to look for not only the factors that the coefficients 4 and 20 would have in common, but that your variables x cubed and x squared would have in common. So on this first example, we're going to talk about the 4 and 20. So a factor that 4 and 20 could have in common in this case would be 4. 4 is a factor of 4 and 4 is a factor of 20. So I'm going to start my greatest common factor by using 4. And then after I use the 4, then I'm going to look at my variables, and I have x cubed and x squared, which remember, x cubed is telling me that there's x times x times x 3 times. And x squared is telling me that it's x times x. So I'm going to say that my greatest common factor between x cubed and x squared would be x squared. Okay, it would have 2 x's as factors in common. Now, once I decide on the greatest common factor, and I'm going to factor that out, I'm going to use the distributive property, sort of in the reverse order of what we're used to using it. We're going to put the monomial back on the outside of the parentheses and then make our binomial inside, so that when we redistribute this, we would end up with our 4x cubed plus 20x squared. So if I factor 4x squared from my 4x cubed, what am I going to multiply times 4x squared to make a 4x cubed? Well, the 4 would multiply by 1, so we'd start with 1, and then x squared would have to multiply by x to make x cubed. So 1x leaves me with just simply an x here for my first term. Plus, then again, what do I have to multiply times 4x squared to end up with 20x squared? Well, for the 4 and the 20, I would have to multiply by 5, and since x squared doesn't need to multiply by anything to make x squared, except for 1, I'm just going to end up with x plus 5, and there ends my binomial. So you can see this is what normally we usually see when we talk about the distributive property and we distribute the 4x squared. So we're using that same distributive property just in a reverse fashion from what we normally are used to using it. Okay, let's try another example. Let's try 9n squared minus 24n, and we're going to look at this and decide what do these two terms have in common. So we're going to talk about 9 and 24 and what they would have in common. And 9 and 24 are going to have a 3 in common as a greatest common factor. 3 is the biggest factor that 9 and 24 both share. And then as far as the variables go, n and n squared would simply have an n in common. So we're going to start with 3n as our greatest common factor, and then we're going to make our binomial that we have left here. So we've got 9n squared. So if I need to make 3n to multiply out to 9n squared, 3 times 3 will give me my 9, and n times n will give me the n squared. Minus, finish out my binomial here, what will I multiply by 3n to make 24n? Well, to get 3 to be 24, 3 times 8 would make my 24. And then to multiply n to make n, I just need a 1. So that's actually going to finish up my binomial there, 3n minus 8. And that's how you remove the greatest common factor from both of those. Now, the next two, you'll notice you have multiple variables, and so we'll take a look at those when you get back to class.